In today's gripping story, we will uncover the case that forever changed the life of Officer Rick Barnes. A phone call in the middle of the night carried the desperate voice of a child. "Help me, I'm hungry," was all Rick needed to hear to understand that something terrible was happening. On the other end of the line was a boy, alone, on the brink of death, weakened by hunger and malnutrition, without the strength to go on. Against all the rules, Rick made a decision that would put his career at risk, but he never imagined what he would find in that trailer. A dark secret awaited him, something that would shake even the most experienced officer. What Rick discovered that night was more than a mission. It was a calling to save a life. And you, do you have the courage to find out what happened? Before we reveal this story that will amaze you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can access real stories that will make you laugh, cry, and reflect. The clock struck 8 p.m. as Rick Barnes, a dedicated Milwaukee police officer, began another night shift. For him, this routine was already part of his life. Between calls about common emergencies, street conflicts, and accident reports, he knew the night often brought surprises, sometimes unpleasant ones. However, that night, something happened that he would never forget. The phone rang, and Rick answered with his usual professional demeanor. But the voice he heard on the other end of the line was different. Weak, almost a whisper, it was laden with pain and desperation. "Help me, please," said the child's voice, breaking the silence of the room. Rick immediately became alert. It was rare to receive calls like this, especially from children. He tried to stay calm and follow protocol. "This is the police. How can I help you?" His voice was firm, but deep down, he felt unease. The child hesitated before responding. The frailty in his words was evident. "I'm hungry," he said, as if that confession was the last thing he could do before giving up. Rick frowned. His instincts told him something very serious was happening. "What's your name? Where are you?" he asked, trying to gather information quickly. The small voice replied, "Johnny." Then the silence on the other end of the line became deafening. Rick asked again where the boy was, but Johnny didn't know the exact address. He mentioned that he was in a trailer, alone, and hadn't eaten in 3 days. That was enough to make Rick's heart race. He had dealt with many emergencies before, but the image of a hungry and abandoned child made him abandon any emotional detachment. As he listened to Johnny vaguely describe the location, something in Rick shifted. He couldn't ignore the fear in the boy's voice. This call was unlike any other. It carried a different weight, a plea that felt more like a cry for survival. Rick knew he needed to act fast, but he had no idea that this call would be the beginning of a story that would change his life forever. Rick tried to stay calm as he continued the conversation with Johnny. The boy's voice was weak, filled with fear and exhaustion. "Are you safe now?" the officer asked, trying to reassure him. Johnny paused before answering, and in that silence, Rick felt the weight of loneliness and despair. "I don't know. My stomach hurts a lot," Johnny said, his voice breaking. Rick took a deep breath. He needed more information to locate the boy. "Do you know where your mom is? When was the last time you saw her?" The boy's response hit him like a punch to the gut. "She left a while ago. I don't know where she is." Rick leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter. It wasn't just hunger, it was desperation. Johnny hadn't eaten and had been drinking water for 3 days. With every word the boy spoke, Rick felt the urgency grow. "Can you remember anything that might help me find you?" Rick asked, trying to stay calm. Johnny began to describe the little he knew. Trees around, simple houses, nothing concrete as a point of reference. With every detail shared, Rick realized that Johnny was not just a child in danger, he was struggling to survive in conditions that no child should ever face. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. Still confused, he asked, "How did you manage to call the police, Johnny?" The answer was surprising. "I found an old cell phone here in the trailer. It was on the ground. I think my mom forgot it. It had a little battery left, so I was able to call now," Johnny explained, his voice growing more and more tremulous. Rick was silent for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. It was a miracle the phone still had battery life. But the boy clearly didn't have time to wait. He couldn't leave Johnny hanging. "Johnny, listen. I'm going to find you. I promise," Rick said, trying to instill confidence in the boy. As he hung up, he already knew that promise wasn't just for Johnny. It was for himself. He would do everything to save that boy, no matter the cost. Without hesitation, Rick got up from his desk and informed his colleagues at the station about the situation. 2 patrol cars were busy with incidents and others weren't available. He realized waiting wasn't an option. "I'll go personally," he said, grabbing the car keys. He knew this decision could cause problems with his captain, but what was at stake was far greater than a reprimand. Before leaving, Rick called his partner, Nate Long. He quickly explained the situation while grabbing 2 sandwiches his wife had packed and stuffing them into his pocket. Nate, skeptical, muttered something about wasting time, but Rick ignored him. He knew that simple gesture might be the boy's only meal in days. As they drove, Rick couldn't get the image of Johnny out of his mind. The thought of such a small child, lost and hungry, was unbearable. He adjusted the police radio frequency and accelerated. Within 20 minutes, they arrived in the trailer area. The trailer was dark, surrounded by the stillness of the night, broken only by the occasional barking of dogs in the distance. Rick stepped out of the car quickly, holding a flashlight in one hand and his phone in the other, with Nate following a few steps behind. "Johnny, this is Officer Rick. I'm outside," he called, trying not to sound alarming. There was no response. Approaching the trailer door, Rick noticed it was locked. He knocked firmly enough to be heard, but there was still no sign of Johnny. "Kid, are you there? It's Rick, the officer you called." After a few seconds of silence, a muffled sound came from inside. A low moan, like someone struggling to react. Rick looked at Nate, who nodded in affirmation. It was time to act. Without hesitation, Rick forced the door open with his shoulder. The wood gave way with a dry crack, and the trailer door swung open. The smell that escaped was heavy, a mixture of mold, dirt, and something else Rick couldn't immediately identify. He shone his flashlight inside, and what he saw made his heart tighten. On the floor, lying on his side and clutching his stomach, was Johnny. "Johnny!" Rick called out, kneeling beside the boy. The flashlight revealed pale skin and half-closed eyes that barely reacted to the light. The boy was breathing laboriously, his dry, cracked lips showing clear signs of dehydration. He clutched his stomach with both hands, a gesture that conveyed his pain. "Hey kid, can you hear me? I'm Rick. I'm here now," the officer said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Johnny slowly opened his eyes. Rick immediately grabbed one of the sandwiches he had brought. He knew he needed to act carefully. "I'll give you a little food. Just a small piece, okay? You're really weak." As he unwrapped the sandwich, Nate, who had been shining his light around the rest of the trailer, called for Rick's attention. "Rick, there's something over there," Nate said, pointing toward the back of the trailer. Rick looked in the indicated direction. In a small bedroom on the other side, a figure lay on a bed. Only one leg was visible under the blanket. A chill ran down Rick's spine, but he focused on Johnny for a moment. "Stay with me, kid. I'm going to take care of you," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Rick gave Johnny a small piece of the sandwich and stood, moving cautiously toward the bedroom, with Nate close behind. "Is someone there?" Rick asked as he approached slowly. The flashlight revealed a woman lying on her back, covered up to her shoulders. Marta, Johnny's mother, lay motionless, her skin as pale as a corpse. Rick felt the tension in the air. He gently touched her arm. Her skin was pale, and her lips had a bluish tint. When he felt her pulse, her skin was cold as ice, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible heartbeat. "She's alive," Rick said, feeling a momentary wave of relief. However, he knew her condition was critical. Johnny's mother had been there the whole time, but Rick realized that due to hunger and mental confusion, the boy likely hadn't noticed his mother unconscious on the bed. "She's showing signs of hypothermia," Nate observed, pointing to the thin blanket barely shielding her from the night's cold. Rick quickly covered Marta with everything he could find in the trailer, while Nate was already on the phone calling for an ambulance. The tension in the air was palpable. Every second felt like an eternity as they waited for help. Rick returned to Johnny, who looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Is my mom going to be okay?" the boy asked weakly, still chewing on the sandwich. Rick knelt beside him and held his hand. "She's very weak, but she's alive. And now, with the ambulance on its way, we're going to take care of her." "You did everything you could, Johnny." "You were very brave," the officer said, trying to reassure him. As the sound of the ambulance's siren finally broke the night silence, Rick felt the weight of the situation grow heavier. He had promised to help Johnny, but now he knew saving his mother would be an even greater challenge. The urgency of it all made every action feel critical. Marta needed immediate care, and Johnny needed hope. Rick was determined to give both a fighting chance. Rick turned back to Johnny, who was still looking at him, chewing the small piece of sandwich. "I thought no one was coming," the boy said weakly. Rick gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "I came, Johnny, and I'm going to get you and your mom out of here." Meanwhile, Nate was ensuring the ambulance was on its way, making sure this bleak scene would be the beginning of a change for this family. As Johnny slowly regained some strength with small bites of the sandwich, Rick sat beside him. He knew that to calm the boy, he needed to earn his trust. Using the gentlest tone possible, he began to ask about his life. "Johnny, tell me a little about you and your mom. What happened for you to end up in this situation?" he asked, careful not to push too hard. Johnny took a deep breath, still weak but willing to talk. Perhaps it was the relief of not being alone anymore, or the kindness in Rick's eyes that encouraged him. "My mom always worked hard. She did everything to take care of me, ever since my dad died," he began, his voice trembling. Rick could tell the topic was painful for the boy, but he let him continue at his own pace. "My dad, he was a good man. He worked in a garage and always took me out for pizza when he had time off. But one day, he got sick at home and never came back," Johnny said, discreetly wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Rick felt a pang in his chest. The loss of his father was clearly a turning point in the boy's life. "After that, we had to move. My mom got a job at a clothing factory. She packed boxes and stacked things. It was hard work, but she never complained. She said she did it all for me," Johnny continued as Rick listened attentively. "She left early and came back late, always tired. Sometimes she couldn't even eat before going to bed." Johnny paused as if searching for the right words. "A few months ago, things started getting worse. The factory brought in some new machines and my mom said they did everything faster. She was afraid of losing her job, and then that's exactly what happened. They let her go." Rick noticed Johnny's voice beginning to falter, not just from weakness, but from the emotional weight of recalling those moments. "Without her job, we didn't have any money. She tried to get credit to buy food, but no one helped. We ate less and less. She cried a lot. Then she started sleeping more. I think she didn't want to feel the hunger," Johnny said, his eyes now welling with tears. Rick placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You were very brave, Johnny. Your mom is strong too. We're going to help both of you get through this, okay?" Johnny nodded, trying to hold back his tears. As the boy spoke, Rick understood the extent of this family struggle. A mother who did everything she could to care for her son, despite facing loss, poverty, and despair. A child who, despite it all, kept hope alive by picking up a phone and seeking help. For Rick, this was no longer just an emergency call. It was a chance to give a fresh start to a family that life seemed to have forgotten. When the paramedics arrived at the trailer, Rick felt a mix of relief and urgency. Marta was in critical condition, and they quickly worked to stabilize her before placing her on a stretcher. Johnny, still very weak, watched the scene while holding Rick's hand tightly, as if afraid of being left behind. As the paramedics assessed Marta, one of them turned to Johnny, noting his frail condition. "He needs medical attention too," said the paramedic, pointing to the boy's pale appearance and clear signs of dehydration. Rick nodded, understanding the necessity. "Johnny, you'll go with your mom. They'll take care of you at the hospital," Rick said firmly and reassuringly. Johnny looked at Rick with fear and uncertainty. "What if I can't stay with her? What if I never see her again?" he asked, his voice trembling. Rick knelt beside him and held his hands. "You need to trust me. They'll take care of you and your mom. I promise I'll be there when you're out," the officer said, trying to convey all the confidence he could. The paramedics helped Johnny into the ambulance alongside Marta, and Rick watched as the vehicle sped off, its sirens cutting through the quiet of the night. He stood there for a moment, reflecting on everything the boy had endured. It wasn't just hunger, it was the weight of a despair no child should have to bear. At the hospital, Johnny was immediately taken to the emergency ward. He was severely dehydrated and malnourished, and the doctors started him on intravenous fluids. The boy was hospitalized for 2 days, receiving all the necessary care to regain his strength. During this time, he began showing signs of recovery. His once pale cheeks gained a slight rosy hue, and his voice, which had been barely a whisper, began to grow stronger. Meanwhile, Rick maintained constant contact with the hospital, ensuring that Johnny and Marta were being well cared for. He knew the road to recovery would be long, but those first steps were essential. For Rick, every update about the boy's improvement was a relief, but he knew there was still much to be done. When Johnny was discharged from the hospital, Rick was already waiting for him at the reception area, fulfilling the promise he had made. The boy, still visibly shy, slowly walked toward the officer, a mix of relief and insecurity in his eyes. "I knew you'd come," Johnny said with a faint smile, holding an improvised backpack with his few belongings. Rick knelt to his level and placed a hand on his shoulder. "A promise is a promise, kid. Now let's go home," he replied, smiling. On the way, Rick explained that his wife, Sonia, was excited to meet him. "She prepared something special for you," the officer said, trying to ease the nervousness Johnny was showing. When they arrived at Rick's house, Sonia greeted them with a warm hug and a smile that immediately made Johnny feel welcome. "Hi, Johnny, we've been waiting for you," she said, her sweetness breaking through the boy's barriers. Soon, Sonia led Johnny to the kitchen, where a warm and hearty meal awaited him. The aroma of homemade food filled the air, something Johnny hadn't experienced in a long time. He hesitated, as if it was too good to be true, and looked at Rick and Sonia for reassurance. "Eat as much as you want. It's all for you," Sonia said, pulling out a chair for him. Johnny started slowly, but soon gave in to the meal. Each bite seemed to restore a piece of his lost strength. Rick and Sonia watched silently, exchanging glances filled with compassion and admiration. "How long do you think it's been since he had a meal like this?" Sonia whispered, visibly moved. Rick just shook his head, unable to put into words the sadness he felt imagining all that Johnny had endured. After the meal, Sonia showed Johnny the guest room she had prepared with care. There were new clothes on the bed, simple toys on a shelf, and a soft blanket folded neatly in the corner. "This will be your room while you're here," she said with a smile. Johnny stood still for a moment, unsure how to react. Finally, he murmured, "Thank you." That night, as Johnny slept peacefully for the first time in months, Rick and Sonia sat in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. "He needed us, Rick. It wasn't a coincidence that you took that call," Sonia said, holding her husband's hand. Rick nodded, glancing toward the room where Johnny was. "I never thought something like this would change my life so much," he replied. In the following days, Johnny began to regain more of his strength. The safe environment, constant care, and proper nutrition restored not only his health, but also his hope. He started smiling more, talking with Rick and Sonia, and even playing with the few toys he had been given. For Johnny, the house wasn't just a temporary place. It was a refuge that made him believe in a better future again. A few days later, Rick entered Johnny's room with a smile. "Today's a special day, kid. We're going to visit your mom at the hospital," he said, holding a bag with some clean clothes Sonia had prepared. Johnny jumped out of bed excitedly, his eyes shining with anticipation and nervousness. "Is she better?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. Rick nodded. "She's awake and waiting for you." On the way to the hospital, Johnny held Rick's hand tightly. He didn't say much, but the grip of his small hand showed how much that moment meant. When they arrived, they were led to Marta's room. The door was slightly ajar, and Johnny peeked in before entering. His mother was sitting on the bed, still pale, but with a serene expression. When her eyes met her son's, tears began streaming down her face. "Johnny!" Marta exclaimed, opening her arms. The boy ran to her, hugging her tightly. "I missed you so much, Mom," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Marta stroked his hair, sobbing. "I missed you too, my love. I thought I'd never see you again. Please forgive me for everything," she said, her voice breaking with tears. Rick stood at the door, giving them space. He watched silently, feeling grateful to have been a small part of that renewed connection. Marta looked at Rick, moved. "Thank you, officer. You saved my son. And me too," she said sincerely. Rick simply nodded with a humble smile. "You're both strong. You just needed a little push," he replied. Marta cupped Johnny's face with both hands, looking into his eyes. "I promise I'll never let you go through anything like this again. I'll fight for us, my son. I'll never give up again," she said with determination. Johnny smiled, wiping his tears. "I knew you'd be okay, Mom. Now we have Rick and Sonia too," he said, glancing gratefully at the officer. The rest of the visit was filled with laughter and shared stories. Marta told Johnny that the doctors were confident in her recovery and that she would soon be discharged. The boy spoke excitedly about Rick and Sonia's home, Sonia's cooking, and how safe he felt for the first time in a long time. When visiting hours ended, Johnny gave his mother a tight hug. "I'll come back tomorrow, okay?" he said. Marta smiled, drying her tears. "I'll be here waiting for you, my love." Rick placed a hand on Johnny's shoulder and guided him out, while the light in Marta's eyes seemed brighter than ever. That day, Rick realized that although challenges still lay ahead, the love between mother and son was a powerful force capable of overcoming any obstacle. He knew the family's struggle was far from over, but now there was hope, and that was what truly mattered. After leaving the hospital, Marta and Johnny were welcomed by Rick and Sonia at their home. In the backyard, there was a small guest house that the couple usually used for visitors or storage. But in this situation, they transformed it into a temporary home for Marta and her son. "It's simple, but it's ready for you," Sonia said, handing Marta the key. With tears in her eyes, Marta thanked them deeply, feeling for the first time in a long while that she could breathe easily. In the early days, Marta was still recovering physically and emotionally. Sonia took charge of helping with daily tasks, while Rick, in his free time, mobilized the community to support the family. Neighbors brought furniture, clothes, and food, ensuring that Marta and Johnny had what they needed to start over. Even Rick's fellow officers contributed, reinforcing the sense of solidarity around them. During this time, Marta began rebuilding her confidence. Sonia encouraged her to seek new opportunities and believe in the value she could bring. Rick used his contacts to introduce Marta to a small office that needed a secretary. The interview was a success, and soon she got the job. "You achieved this on your own, Marta," Sonia said, seeing her smile with the contract in hand. Marta, her eyes shining, replied, "I wouldn't be here without you." With a steady salary and fewer work hours, Marta began saving money. Meanwhile, Johnny thrived in his new routine. He loved the welcoming environment of Rick and Sonia's home and quickly felt at ease. Meals were plentiful, security was constant, and he had returned to being just a boy, something hunger and despair had stolen from him for so long. After a few months, with the support of Rick, Sonia, and the community, Marta managed to rent her own home. It was simple but dignified, with enough space for her and Johnny to truly restart. On moving day, Rick and Sonia helped carry boxes and set up furniture. "You gave us more than a roof over our heads. You gave us hope," Marta said emotionally as she looked at their new home. Johnny ran to hug Rick before he left. "Thank you for everything, Officer Rick," the boy said, clutching the arm of the man he now saw as a true hero. Rick knelt down and looked into Johnny's eyes. "Never stop believing in yourself and your mom. You two are stronger than you realize." Over time, Marta became a role model in the community, sharing her story of overcoming. Johnny returned to school, where he made new friends and displayed an infectious enthusiasm for life. For Rick and Sonia, the success of that family was a constant reminder that sometimes a simple act of kindness can be the difference between despair and a fresh start. And for Marta and Johnny, the experience was not just a miracle, but the beginning of a life filled with possibilities. 6 months had passed since the night Rick answered that desperate call. Life seemed to have settled into a calmer rhythm for everyone. Marta and Johnny were living in their new home, rebuilding their days with safety and stability. Rick and Sonia remained present in their lives, visiting them regularly. But fate seemed to have one more surprise in store for the couple who had changed the future of that family. One morning, Sonia was restless. Something had been different about her in recent days, a feeling she couldn't ignore. "Rick, I think we need to go to the doctor," she said with an enigmatic smile. Rick, always attentive, noticed the different glow in his wife's eyes. "All right, let's go," he replied, holding her hand. A few hours later, the two walked out of the doctor's office with news that would change their lives. Sonia was pregnant. At first, Rick was silent, absorbing the moment. But as they walked back to the car, he stopped and held Sonia's face in both hands. "This is a gift, Sonia, a gift I never thought I'd be ready to receive," he said, his eyes glistening with tears. That night, as the two discussed the news, Rick couldn't help but think of Johnny. He remembered how, months ago, he had hesitated to take responsibility for that hungry and frightened boy. The idea of being a father figure had scared him, but Johnny had taught him something he had never realized. Fatherhood isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, protecting, and loving unconditionally. "Can you believe all of this started with that call?" Rick said as he gently placed his hand on Sonia's still flat belly. "If it weren't for Johnny, I never would have believed I could be a father. He showed me that even when we're scared, we can make a difference in someone's life." Sonia smiled and held his hand. Maybe all of this was connected. Maybe that call didn't just change Johnny and Marta's lives, but ours too. Rick nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and reverence for everything that had happened. The following months were filled with joy and preparation. Marta and Johnny were the first to hear the news, and Johnny was ecstatic. "I'm going to have a little brother or sister?" he asked, his eyes sparkling. "That's right, kid, and I'm going to need a good advisor to help me be a better dad," Rick joked as he ruffled the boy's hair. When the baby was born, Rick held the child in his arms for the first time and felt something he could never describe. He looked at Sonia, then at Johnny, who stood next to Marta in the hospital room, and realized that everything from that night 6 months ago was connected. That call, which had seemed like just another emergency, had transformed not only the lives of a family in despair, but also his own. In that moment, Rick understood that the true strength of fatherhood lies in the love we're able to give, even when we don't know what the future holds. The miracle of life wasn't just in Rick's arms, but in the journey that he, Sonia, Marta, and Johnny had traveled together. It was a lesson in faith, courage, and love that bound them forever. If you made it this far, comment below, "I made it to the end." Share this story and help spread the emotion to more people. Just click share and let this remarkable story touch others.